Today's youth need teachers, volunteers, and most of all, well, they need you. I'm Doug Edwards, and I'm going to be talking with real youth mentors and students to give you the knowledge you need to be the best youth worker possible. This is Youth Worker on Fire.
Oh, you're trying to bring me down and run me out of town. You're taking what you want, but you can't take my rhythm now. I'm walking to my own beat, just gonna be me. I'm not replicating nobody.
Welcome back, youth workers. This is Doug. Glad you're joining us today again with Youth Worker on Fire. I hope that you're out there and you've gotten my book already. You've gone through that. You're using it with your volunteers, using it to encourage yourself and to stay on track. Today, I'm going to talk about leadership, about another man who's written a lot of books. His name is Dr. John Maxwell. Now, if you know anything about leadership, probably one of the biggest leadership developers in the world has been Dr. Maxwell. He set out to develop 1 million leaders worldwide, and now I believe it's been tens of millions. So my mother-in-law got my wife and I a leadership Bible by Dr. John Maxwell. In fact, it's called the Maxwell Leadership Bible. There's a particular section there I looked at this week, and I'm going to give you that rundown. I'm not going to go into great depth about it, but just to kind of shake you up and make you think and look toward what you're doing in student ministries. And if you're a dad, mom, another type of leader in another organization, but you have adolescents in your life, this is good for everybody. But if you're a youth pastor, youth worker, a volunteer, business owner, you're going to want to know this stuff. Some of these things sting me for what I have done and what I haven't done. And some of these things I get to check off and go, yes, I did that. He's talking specifically in the book of Kings here and talking about leadership of kings and leaders. And, you know, you had Saul and the leadership that he had intended to get out of his son Jonathan was not the leader he ended up with. In fact, he was trying to get rid of David, who became the second king. David's son Solomon was not the guy that the rest of the siblings was hoping was going to be king after David, but Solomon became the man, and most people know Solomon's story. So getting that in your history there and going back and looking at some of the kings, this has everything to do with us in leadership, period. That's what the Bible does. It gives us leadership tips and leadership wisdom. So here's the outline that John Maxwell writes at the beginning of 1 Kings. He said, lessons in leadership. Number one, success without a successor is a failure. Solomon failed to get the successor that he wanted, but David got the successor he wanted. And God got the successor he wanted the second time, which was David. Remember, the first time it was the will of the people that elected Saul. It was the will of the Father, of God, that selected David. So success without a successor is a failure. What about you? Are you looking at the end, or are you one of those guys that's going to, or ladies that are going to be 1-2 years, 2 to 5 years, and then you just move on? Or are you thinking about who can take my place? One of the best guys I saw at that in student ministry in our area was Clark Blake. We talk about Clark here and there. He was an icon as far as volunteers. He's a volunteer for the Fellowship of Christian Athletes for over 30 years in Lake County, Florida. He was their Fellowship of Christian Athletes director for at least 30 years. His last couple of years, he was always looking for the next successor. Some of those fell through. He ended up with people that he did not expect to or intend to end up with. I tried for years to try to get our church to understand, hey, listen, we've got to get a couple of guys in here to help me so that we have this flow from middle school, high school, college. I never could get them to buy into it. So I was not successful with getting a successor, even after being there for 29 years. But the place I was with before in campus life, the great thing was there, I didn't get a successor, but they realized the value of the program, and they did get a successor for that program. And so the second thing that he writes in this lesson on leadership is decision making and problem solving is the fastest way to gain influence. And here's what I'll tell you about being in the game and doing well in student ministry. Number one, is this where God wanted you to go, or are you just taking the first job that came your way? The second thing is, are you planning a 5-year, 10-year? Are you looking at the future? Are you ahead of your boards, ahead of your congregation, ahead of your students, ahead of your staff, so that you are leading and not following the stream and the 21 laws of leaders or of leadership that Maxwell writes about, and it's called the Big Mo. And that motion that's in process, that your motivation, you're moving and shaking. And he says, is the Big Mo leading you, or are you guiding the Big Mo, that momentum that's going there? And so when you're making decisions and stuff, you don't want your leadership to control you. And I'm not saying that in a negative way. I'm saying that most churches don't know where student ministry needs to go. My question to you is, do you? Do you know where it needs to go? Do you know where you want to take students and take your volunteers in the process of leading them through a path that's going to lead them through life with or without you, but always with Jesus? You need to know that you have something in place, a program in place to keep pushing you toward the future and pushing your students into leadership capability and ability. So you want to make sure that you have some kind of discipleship making, not led just by you. The third thing that Maxwell writes in this leadership Bible in 1 Kings is check your motives before you lead anything. What's your reasoning for leading? Who are you leading and why are you leading them? Do you just want to be the big cheese? Do you want to be the big person that everybody looks up to? Or do you want to lead out of love? You want to lead out of care. The issue is not prioritizing our schedule, is number 4, but scheduling our priorities. I want to go back to check your motives, though, before you lead anything. When Jesus was with the Pharisees, is at one of their places eating a meal, and this lady breaks into the party. In fact, this comes from Mark Batterson's book, Not Safe, and the chapter is called Crash the Party. And this lady comes in, and all the Pharisees can talk about is, number one, if he was a real prophet, he would know that she's a sinner. And what a waste, because she came in weeping and crying and pouring this expensive perfume on Jesus' feet. And the tradition was that when a guest enters your home, you're supposed to wash their feet. And the Pharisees did none of that. And she comes in, breaks into the party, finds a way in, and pours this perfume on his feet and weeps and cries over his feet and wipes his feet with her hair. And long hair was a symbol of beauty for a woman and very important. And she takes her hair and wipes his dirty feet with this expensive perfume and her tears. And they're going, if man, he knew she's a sinner, man. That's all they're labeling her. And what they called sin and what they called waste, he called beautiful, is what Batterson writes. And here's what he says about Pharisees, and you're going to identify this in leadership with yourself and with other people. He said, God sees a reflection of himself when he sees us. And I love what John, before I even read this chapter so much, and I don't want to take all, I'm telling you right up front, this is Batterson's stuff. This is not mine. The other part is John Maxwell, but this part of John Maxwell is check your motives before you lead anything. The only thing the Pharisees saw when they looked at this woman was a sinner. I think Jesus saw an innocent little girl, is what Batterson writes. An innocent little girl playing with her favorite doll, a little girl who had hopes and dreams that were nothing like the reality she was living. He sees past the past. He sees past the sin. He sees his image in us, like looking in a mirror. God sees a reflection of himself. And this is what Batterson writes next. Pharisees treat people based on past performance. Prophets treat people based on future potential. Pharisees give people something to live down to. Prophets give people something to live up to. Pharisees write people off. Prophets write people in. Pharisees see sin. Prophets see the image of God. Pharisees give up on people. Prophets give them a second chance. The Pharisees reduce this woman to a label, sinner, and we do the same. We give people political labels, religious labels, but in the process, we strip them of their individuality and complexity. Jesus is in the business of turning bad beginnings into happily ever afters. He did it for the woman caught in the act of adultery. He did it for the thief on the cross. Are you listening to that? Check your motives. What's your reasoning? What are your motives for your student ministry? Whatever your motives are, you're going to project them onto your staff. You're going to project them onto your students, and they're going to have the attitude that you had. One thing Youth for Christ taught me before I even went to a church, I was so grateful for the pain of learning that I went through with Youth for Christ campus life, and it was painful for me. It stripped away. God had been stripping away things that I thought I knew and understood about my Christian faith for several years. And when I went to Youth for Christ, He spent those 6 years I was there stripping away and breaking me down and showing me that what I thought was true was not the way it was at all, and is not the way that He intended me to see things. He broke them down. So when I went to a church, I could go in and say, we want you to bring your friends. This place is a safe place for them to come. This place is a place we're going to have fun with. And I want you to learn to lead and not to just participate. And so the first students in those first years, and for many years, we were able to help them understand you are here to lead because you say you know Jesus personally. You are here to bring your friends, Christian and non-Christian, believers and non-believers, and you're here not to judge them, but to love them and let us love them and tell them about Jesus. What is your motive when you go to church? What is your motive when you go to your workplace? What is your motive? Is it Pharisaical? I see them, they are bad people. Or is it prophetic? I see the potential in these people. I brought scary students onto retreats. I brought scary students and allowed my students to bring them into a church environment. Not only were those students scary, but our church environment was scary. Churches can be cruel to people. Student ministries can be cruel to people. They're usually not safe places. Is your place a safe place? Jesus was a safe place. When you came to Him, you fell into safety. Women were used as commodities and property and lesser and not citizens. They were to belong to a man. They met Jesus, and when women met Jesus, they were drawn to Him because they saw that He saw them. And that applies to students and children. Do we see them? Or do we just expect them to be something that they have no clue about? Do we judge them and label them? Or do we see their potential? I used to tell middle schoolers and the people that are working with middle schoolers, and in this podcast, I still say it. I loved middle school students. I loved my staff that were there. I loved high schoolers. I loved college students. It was something that God developed in me and put in me that I had no idea was there. But I realized, because a couple of things, books I read and people I learned about that worked with middle schoolers, that middle school student ministry was probably the most valuable ministry of the entire church, because it is when they're making their biggest decisions. They're going from concrete thinking to abstract thinking, which is adult thinking, and they're developing, they're changing. It is the most creative time in their life. I started seeing them as future leaders. I started pouring into my staff there, pouring in volunteer staff, pouring into that program as much as I did the other programs. And I would talk to them as though they had huge potential, the way I'm talking about them right now. I would say the things that you're thinking about doing now are probably the things you'll end up wanting to do the rest of your life. God sees you now as middle schoolers, as leaders, as people that are going to change the future of this world. You are significant. You matter. And so I'm saying this to you, that all adolescents matter. Your volunteer staff matter, but remember, they're connected to families, and those families matter. So here's the rest of those things I'm just going to go through, because maybe they'll stick with you in the rest of this leadership list. The issue is not prioritizing or scheduling, but scheduling our priorities. Influencing followers is addition. Influencing leaders is multiplication. Keep first things first. Distraction is the enemy of direction. Leaders must touch a heart before they ask for a hand. The number one thing that we would say, that I was taught and come to find out it was there and possibly business, was they don't care how much you know till they know how much you care. Until you've immersed yourself into their schools, into their families, and into those lives, and your volunteer staff. I would have my volunteer staff on our club night, which would be your student ministry night. If there was a band concert or a football game, and some of our students were there and had to be there and could not be with us, I would make sure that I had enough staff so that I could say, okay, I want you and you to go to that concert while we're doing this meeting. I want you and you to go to that ball game. You don't have to stay the whole time, but make sure that our students see that you're there. You wave at them, you say hi to their parents, you love up on them, and then come back and tell us how it was and how it went. And if they weren't able to come back, I'd say, great, stay there. But if you can stay for a while, make sure you're heard and you're seen and you're gone. So remember, I talked about that in one of our youth worker episodes, be heard, be seen, be gone. And my volunteer staff would do that because why? We saw them as potential leaders. We saw the value. Last three things that Maxwell writes: a divided leader eventually produces a divided nation, or a divided congregation, or a divided student ministry. What your small group or your student ministry is doing and developing is leaderships for the nations, leaders for the nations. Passion and conviction mark the difference between a great leader and a mediocre one. That was the next to the last point that he made. Passion and conviction mark the difference between a great leader and a mediocre one. And the last point he makes, John Maxwell, is this: principles, not emotions, should guide your leadership. Principles, not emotions, should guide your leadership. And so the last story I have for you is from the book, Not Safe. And it's about a guy by the name of Joshua Chamberlain. I'd never heard of this guy until I read this in the book. After the war, he writes, Joshua Chamberlain went on to serve as the 32nd governor of Maine and the president of his alma mater. In 1893, 30 years after his act of heroism, he was awarded the Medal of Honor by President Grover Cleveland for holding his position on the Little Round Top against repeated assaults and carrying the advanced position on the Great Round Top, which was that battle area. In his later years, Chamberlain would reflect back on the war with these words: I had deep within me the inability to do nothing. I knew I may die, but I also knew that I would not die with a bullet in my back. The inability to do nothing. Isn't that the standard Jesus set? Joshua Chamberlain was a student of theology and a professor of rhetoric, not a soldier. But when duty called, Chamberlain answered. He climbed the ranks to become colonel of the 20th Maine Volunteer Infantry Regiment, Union Army. On July 2nd, 1863, Chamberlain and his 300 soldiers regiment were all that stood between the Confederates and certain defeat at a battlefield in Gettysburg, Pennsylvania. At 2:30 p.m., the 15th and 47th Alabama Infantry regiments of the Confederate Army charged, but Chamberlain and his men held their ground. By the last charge, only 80 Blues stood standing. Chamberlain himself was knocked down by a bullet that hit his belt buckle, but the 34-year-old schoolteacher got right back up. It was his date with destiny. When Sergeant Tozier informed Chamberlain that no reinforcements were coming and his men were down to 1 round of ammunition per soldier, Chamberlain knew he needed to act. Their lookout, a young boy, perched high in a tree on Little Round Top, informed Colonel Chamberlain that the Confederates were forming rank. The rational thing to do at that point, with no ammunition and no reinforcements, would have been to surrender. But Chamberlain wasn't wired that way. In full view of the enemy, Chamberlain climbed onto the barricade of stones and gave a command. He pointed his sword and yelled, "Charge!" And in what ranks as one of the most improbable victories in military history, 80 Union soldiers captured 4,000 Confederates in 5 minutes flat. What seemed like a suicide mission saved the Union. Historians believe that if Chamberlain had not charged, the rebels would have gained the high ground. If the rebels had gained the high ground, there is a good chance they would have won the Battle of Gettysburg. If the rebels had won that battle, the historical consensus is that the Confederates would have won the war. One man's courage saved the day, saved the war, and saved the Union. That is how the kingdom of God advances. Going all in means leaving safety behind. And once again, that's from the book, Not Safe. And it's the chapter called Charge. So I'll leave you with that. Principles, not emotions, should guide your leadership when it comes to student ministry or any leadership. Leadership is not easy. Leadership is hard. You will want to quit. You will feel like you're alone many times. You will need to go to be strengthened and nourished over and over and over and over and over again. You will face battles that you will feel like you will not win. But the best thing to do is go, God, which way do you want me to go? Do you want me to go forward? Do you want me to retreat? And never retreat unless God says retreat. Never give up until God says it's over. And God is the big cheese. He's it. I don't remember him saying in anything in Scripture to give up, except when Jesus died on the cross. But that was to win the ultimate victory. So all I can tell you is follow your heart, nourish yourself, get the rest that you need, because I believe in rest. Get the people around you that you need. Take care of yourself. Take care of your family. Get spiritual people around you that are bigger than you, that are better than you, that have already been there before you, that have accomplished more than you. If you have lesser people ahead of you training you and loving you, not just in your church, it's got to be in your church, outside your community. Maybe it's going to end up being some of it outside your country. I don't know. but stay healthy and follow God and make sure that you don't get a bullet in your back. Always charge ahead. All right, youth workers, that's all I got today. Have a great one. Love you guys.
You've been listening to the Youth Worker on Fire podcast. If you like what you hear, please subscribe and tell your friends. Also, leave a comment and tell us what you think. Stay tuned for more informative episodes.